Welcome to our presentation on frameworks and libraries. We're going to be comparing the difference between an HTML5, so base HTML, CSS, and JavaScript with Vue, React, and Angular. If you're not familiar, these are frameworks and libraries. If you're not familiar with a framework and a library, explain what it is. So a library is intended to be added on top of base like HTML5. And whenever I say HTML5, I'm talking about basic HTML5, CSS3, and JavaScript. And a library is usually going to be sort of included through JavaScript. It's going to give you some helpful functions and might include some sort of packager to be put on top to help package everything together. But generally, it's not going to be compiled. Whereas a framework is usually compiled. They'll have a bigger, your projects will usually have a lot more files, but things are generally a lot neater, a lot easier to work with. So frameworks offer a lot of flexibility whenever you're working with like a big project where you have a lot of team members working on something, because they're sort of built for that. And libraries can do that as well, but you'll have to maintain a lot of it on your own, since we'll get into React in a minute, but React is a library, and it doesn't include any of the features that you'll need in a modern web development. You have to include those as extra libraries on top of the React library. So React is owned and maintained by Facebook, but is open source. React does not have any officially supported external plugins, so it includes the base React app and nothing else. Anything for routing, animations, all that stuff is going to have to be included with an external library that's maintained by somebody else. Angular is owned and maintained by Google. It's also they're all open source. It's owned and maintained by Google, but it's a lot bigger. It has a big testing framework. It has routing options, animations, and all that stuff built in, as well as the option to import external libraries to make your life easier. Angular has seen a lot of changes over its lifespan. AngularJS, and whenever I refer to Angular, I refer to Angular 2 and above. The Angular version that the projects are made out of is Angular version 8. But a lot of people will confuse, there is AngularJS and there's Angular. AngularJS is basically Angular version 1. And then Angular 2 and above are like a separate project. But most people are using Angular now and not using AngularJS anymore because Google sort of left it to die and community support is not enough to keep it alive. And then we move on to Vue. So Vue, again, open source. Vue is actually created by a Google employee who was kind of tired of Angular and just wanted to build something that works better than Angular. And it has a lot of features that you see that are similar to Angular, but without some of the extras like a big testing framework and everything on top. So it's really nice for people who don't want to learn all about testing frameworks and all that stuff. So it also includes basic options with routing, and it's made up of completely separate files, or actually all of a like page or a component's elements are built into one file. So you have your template or your HTML, you have your styles, which is CSS, and you have your script, which is your JavaScript, all is in one file, and this is a Vue file. Whereas in Angular, you'll have like a CSS file, a template file, you'll have a TypeScript file, and TypeScript is basically JavaScript, but with types. So it's It leads to better code writing, but it is sort of something else to learn. That's something you have to take into consideration whenever you're sort of looking at these. Is that if you do decide to use Angular, Angular uses TypeScript. So you'll have 4 files for each sort of page or component, whereas Vue you'll have one file. And React, well, since React is a library, you can have it set up pretty much however you want. But most of the time, you're just going to have one JS file per component. So let's look at our sample project. Let me go ahead. All right, so very simple project. This is the one that we're going to be using to compare with all of our other options. This is base HTML, so this does not have any fancy features, no two-way data binding, nothing fancy. Everything is sort of kept together through a JavaScript file. Everything is kept together through a JavaScript file. It's not very responsive, but it works. You have the ability to search. So I search for that email, and I can do that. If the whenever you're doing web development, make sure that you disable autocorrect on search fields, especially when you're dealing with this. I forgot to do that. But yeah, you can search for users. You can add a user. Since double O's in the you can create a user, creates the user, you delete a user. Very simple. Documentation is just some basic lorem ipsum text, nothing fancy. But you'll see that whenever I click on this, you'll notice that up here the entire page reloads. So not only is it not responsive, but all of these elements, like the top up here, the footer, especially whenever you get on like a big page, all of this has to reload, which is not ideal, especially when you have a lot of stuff going on. So let's look at the code. So in here we have some basic headers. If you haven't already seen the WebDev tutorials, we go over this a little bit more in depth. There's 4 of them. They're about an hour long from our previous WebDev meetings. They'll explain all this. But basically, the HTML code's pretty straightforward. We are using Bootstrap to on all of the projects. They all look exactly the same. That's why I wanted to use Bootstrap, so I didn't have to custom make a bunch of CSS styles. So it just gives you some nice CSS styling. It has all of the icons and everything set up correctly. Yeah. And you'll notice that whenever we're going through here, if we look at the about.html, which is the documentation, we have to rewrite all of these headers again, which is a huge pain. Even if it is just like copying and pasting, that's not at all convenient. But let's look at sort of the crux of this program. And the CSS styling, here's, if you want to look at it really quickly, I'll have all this on GitHub after the meeting, but it's very, very simple. There's nothing fancy about it, and this is going to be the same styling across all of the projects because Bootstrap handles most of the styling that we need. So most of the program logic is in the JavaScript file. Something that is extremely inconvenient is there's no way to bind data to a page. That doesn't exist in basic HTML5. You can't just say, oh, well, this is attached to this, and this should update when this updates. That's not how that works. So every time you update an element, you have to reload all of the users. If you add a user, you have to reload all the users so that it shows up. And what that means is you have to delete all of the elements and then put those elements back on the page, which is extremely ugly. And this nice little piece definitely not copied from Stack Overflow, was the only reason that I was able to figure out how to actually reload, because it just goes through the DOM and grabs elements with certain types and it deletes them. It's a huge pain. Huge pain. And then, this isn't even the worst part. When we actually start getting to creating these users, you have to manually define all of the elements as JavaScript objects and then put them on the page. If you've ever done like Java FX or something like that, and you've ever done it through straight up code without FXML, this will look familiar. It's extremely ugly, can lead to spaghetti code really quickly. This is a very, very short website, and it's already pretty spaghetti. So yeah, it's not at all straightforward, and it's a lot of workarounds, and everything that has to deal with like modern browsers. Say if they don't support something, like overwriting prototypes, then you're done for. Like, it just won't work, and you have to maintain that yourself. Huge pain. So, does anybody have any questions about the sample project? About how things are done, or any confusing parts? Nope. All right. So, pros and cons. You get full control over the over everything. You get fast page load times if done right. One of the biggest things that makes like React different from like basic HTML5 is you don't have to deal with like bundling. So whenever you're including a bunch of different libraries, you can have issues where your bundle size is absolutely massive. And when people go to load your page, you can have JavaScript code and stuff that's taking forever to download, which is really ugly and can cause a lot of issues. Whereas React will have a bundler that will take only the pieces from those libraries that you actually need and bundle them together and pack them together into like a single JavaScript file. And that's common across all of the frameworks and libraries. But that's one of the most important parts about React. So yeah, good luck with routing. You'd have to build a custom renderer, which is what React and Angular and Vue do. They all have custom renderers, and that's just way out of the depth that I'm willing to go for this. So yeah, you'd have to manually do links and stuff and manually rebuild pages. It's really ugly, really slow, and really bad. So you're relying on the browser support for modifying the DOM. You get ugly code. You don't get a lot of features. You don't get any features other than what's built into JavaScript. So let's look at the React project. So let's go ahead and collapse all this. So it uses Node for everything. Let's go ahead, npm start on this. Awesome. As you can see, it's the same exact site that we just looked at, except for one thing. You'll notice that there's no button over here for search, because it actually uses data binding to actively look at what's in the search box. So as I type, you'll see that these will actually search as you're doing it. And functionally, it's the exact same. Great. You get another card when you do it here. You can delete. Functionally, it's the exact same. But as you notice, when you look at this top bar, you don't. When I click on things, it doesn't reload. The page doesn't actually reload. It only reloads whenever you click on the main link, which is pretty common. If you ever want to if you're ever having a site that's like glitching out or something, a cool trick, not really a cool trick, but you can click on the actual main site logo. If it's just like there or something, and it'll reload the whole page. That's pretty standard. But like when you're dealing with routing and stuff, you'll route these separately, and only this middle area will actually reload. And we'll look at a little bit how that works. So quickly, you want to skim over the public. So this is where you store like the actual like public files. So like your logos, your images, your fav icons, and a basic index.html that has all of your metadata. And all this does is, well, first it checks if you have JavaScript, because React will not work without JavaScript enabled. And then it has a div with ID root. And this is just telling React where to place all of the all of your files. So we're not going to look too much farther into that. That's basic HTML. As we saw before, this is what is important. So in here, we import React and React DOM, and then some CSS. And that CSS file, same exact thing that we had before. I think I added some like code stuff that was just there. And you'll see that it has this app tag, and this is not in base HTML. What it does is it's importing a JavaScript file as app, and then React sort of takes that JavaScript object and turns it into sort of an HTML object. This is what's called JSX. We'll look at that a little bit more, or a lot bit more. So it loads up this app, and we can go into the app.js. So in here, we have a router, which, as I mentioned before, is not built into React. You have to actually add, it's from React Router DOM is the name of the package that you have to install for a router. It's pretty standard. Pretty much every React app will have that, but it is something extra that you have to take care of. But you'll see we have a function here, a function named app. And at the bottom, we export that default app. And then inside of here, we'll have our HTML code. It looks like HTML code, and it is mostly HTML code, but it's actually JSX. It's a mix of JavaScript and HTML. So you'll see we have HTML stuff here, but then like all the classes are used class name, because you can't use class in JavaScript because class is a reserved word, so you have to use class name. And then you'll see like custom things like link here, which is from the router. And we have a switch here, which tells it, and we see these again, about and home. And we're passing, we have about and home and a path here. And this is the part that actually gets reloaded. Everything else stays the same across it. And you'll see that when we look at like about, for example, it's very small. All it has is what we had written there, and it exports the default about function. That's all it does. It does include, imports a CSS file, which has nothing in it. So yeah, let's look at that home. So looking at the home, it's very simple. It imports a custom-made component in here, components. And one thing that's super nice about this is we can pass data all the way through from this app.js. We have a user list up here, basic JavaScript. We have the user list. We can pass that user list to the home, and then we can pass that. Then you can pass that data to the home body. One thing that is super annoying about React, and it's sort of why I had to change the project about midway through, you can't actually pass data back through to the parent object. Everything that needs to be modified, like as part of this piece. So all of this interacts with these objects, and that means that all of these need to be in the same component, which is a huge pain, because if they need to sort of interact with this main list, they have to be able to access it, and React does not give the ability out of the box to access parent elements. So it can get pretty annoying and confusing. So now we have, now we're going to look at the actual sort of meat of this React app. You have our initial list here, and we have a bunch of use state. So use state basically says, I'm going to be watching this object. And whenever this is actually the object itself, and then a function. This is actually like a callback function. And you would call that function with the updated item. So as you see here, for add user, we call update list with the new items in it. And whenever it sees that we're calling this, it will update that part of the UI, which is super nice because it only updates what it needs to. So just quickly going through here, you'll see that we can delete users, we search, and all these do is do a quick filter on it and updates the list, changes the list with a new list. And then again, we see we can get, we just have a Boolean that determines whether somebody's searching or not. And if they're searching, then it will only show a filtered list, which this function just returns some JSX, which is just a map of an object. And then if we want to get all users, well, it's just a map of the main list object that doesn't have any filters on it. And we see we have a bunch of sort of event handlers on here. We have an onChange for all of these. And every time they change, it gets sent into a function. If you're not familiar, if you haven't seen our videos, these are Lambda functions. So you have a parameter and then something to run. So we're just running the, whenever it changes, it runs the search function. So yeah, you'll be able to go through and read through this. It's fairly easy to understand, but it's kind of really annoying because we have our card content here, and it would be really nice if all of our card content was in one file, but you can't do that because you can't pass data back up through. So if you click delete in here, you'd only be able to modify data that's in here. So if you click delete on it, you can modify the data that's on here, but you can't actually modify the list in of itself because the list is handled by a parent element. And we'll look at the frameworks and how they resolve that. So does anybody have any questions about this? I know I went over it kind of quickly, but we started a bit late. Does anybody have any questions? React does include a testing framework, which is nice. It's very minimal, but it's something. All right. If nobody has any questions, I will go ahead and move on to the next one. So, React, it's fast, especially if you are good about managing your libraries. JSX makes your life a lot easier. You don't have to worry about, you're combining JavaScript and HTML, which is nice, but it can lead to very cluttered spaghetti code if you're not careful. State allows you to only update elements when you need to, and SPAs are great. So an SPA is a single page application. This is what it's called when you have when you don't have to reload all of your site whenever you change something on it. So when I go to documentation, it doesn't reload the whole site. This is what's called a single page app or a single page application because it doesn't, it's actually just one page. We've already gone over the rest of these. Awesome. Let's look at Angular. So the first thing you'll notice when we look at Angular is that it is not necessarily bloated, but there's a lot more in here, just right off the bat. Most of this we can ignore, but we again have our index.html as we had before, pretty much all the same content. This is common among all of them. This is basically where it starts to inject its custom code. And we have an app root here in the body. And just like we saw in React, this is a custom element given to us by Angular, which basically just tells it to load this app component .ts file. And then this app component.ts file, it's a TypeScript file, tells it that it has an HTML file, which, as we saw before, is the basic links with a router. So this has a router link in it. You see that we don't actually have to import anything here because it's sort of built into Angular. So you'll have a router link here, and we have a router outlet. And just like we had in the HTML, where we had this app root, and that tells it where to inject all of the base, like the base website, inside of the HTML, this router outlet tells it where the router needs to put that updating content. So you see that the header and the footer are all the same. Let me actually show you that it's all the same. I'm not going to go through and I'll show you the website pulled up, but for the sake of time, just assume that it's working the exact same as all the other ones. Yep. So you can delete elements with your documentation. You see that it doesn't actually update anything but the stuff that actually needs to be updated. Now this does have a styles. This is actually using Sass or SCSS. I'm not actually taking taking advantage of any of the features, so you can just assume this is just a regular CSS file. If you want to learn a little bit about SCSS, I covered it very quickly in the WebDev fundamental videos that we did. Same exact, literally copy and pasted from the React app, so same styles. And inside of this component, now very quickly, there at the root of all Angular projects is sort of this app.module.ts. This is what registers all of the modules, all of the components and everything in the app. So you see that it has like an Angular core, has some forms stuff, um, Angular platform browser, the routing module. This is all imported from Angular. And then all of your apps, unlike unlike Vue and React, you manually create the files. But in Angular, you actually use ng create component and give it a component name, and it'll add everything here for you. But it builds these components for you, and you'll notice that there's it's like a half-done HTML file because there's like nothing surrounding it. You know, it's literally just the HTML file, just the raw HTML, and you can have your classes and everything. Since it's not JSX, you don't have to use class name or anything. And then it has SCSS files for all of your components, but again, we just have the global SCSS file. I won't be using any custom ones for this one, but we'll notice that in here we did our router outlet, and then inside of our app routing module, we tell it the path. So path slash or empty goes to home component, and path about goes to about component. So if we go to our home component, we see that all it is a header, and then the app user manager component. If we go to about, it's just the about. There's nothing in the SCSS. This is just automated testing. It's testing files it's generated. You don't have to worry about those. And then it comes with the default. And this is all generated for you. This is all default, comes with it. You don't need to understand, you don't really need to worry about this component stuff. So let's get into the meat of this. So you'll see that there's not a whole lot of JavaScript in here, which is super nice. So the JavaScript is completely separated. You will notice that there is some special event handlers here. So we have an event handler for click on this button. And when this button is clicked, it's going to call the onCreate function with fNameField.value. And you see, this is what is called a one-way data bind, which means that the value can be read, but it cannot be updated. So we have a one-way data bind here. So we get the value of LName, FName, LName, and email field. And this doesn't require any JavaScript. It's all handled for you. We'll grab those elements and make them available. And then again, input here. So whenever there's input on this field, it will update and call this function, this onSearch function, with the event. And then down here, we can look at our actual thing that shows the cards. We have, and this is something new, ngIf. You'll see that we have two new things here. We have ngIf and ng4. So this is ngIf and then not is searching. So if it is searching, then it is not going to show this part. It's only going to show the is searching one. And the difference between these is this ng4 here. This is let user of user list. If you know anything about JavaScript, this is basically like an enhanced for loop for JavaScript. So it's doing a for loop over user list. And then it's going through, and we can grab the user, and then it's a user object with fname, lname, ID, and email. And you use these double curly braces to access a variable on the JavaScript side. So it's really easy to read, really easy because everything's separated out into separate sections. You see right here, if it is searching, then we'll be using the search list. So let's look at that JavaScript actually right now. We have our user. We defined a couple users. And since this is TypeScript, we actually need to define all of the types for all of our variables. So we have a user list, which is a user array with some variables inside of it. We have is searching and search list, which starts out as empty. And whenever you delete, it does the exact same things that we did before. that we saw before runs a filter. When it creates, it pushes something on. And then on search, all it does is say if it's not empty, then it's searching. So if it's searching, then don't show all the users, only show the filtered ones, and then it sets the search list with the filtered users. Okay? So, as you can see, one of the major benefits is that everything is separated. Even though there's a lot more files, everything is separated into its own file, which is super convenient when you're trying to read through a bunch of code. Not everything is in a single file. Not everything is in a single function like you can with like you do with React. So makes everything super nice. You can bind data through parents and children. You can pass them as props, which you can do that in React. You can also pass things as props. But if you wanted to pass something from the child to the parent, you have what are called emits, and these as they sound, they emit some sort of call, and then whatever is listening will say, oh, I know that emit, I'm waiting on this emit, and then as soon as it gets it, it'll run a function. So you can actually run things in the parents that the children do. I did not implement that here because that's not something that this project needed, but it could be done if you wanted to separate this out even further with the cards having their individual components and stuff. You could have them emit a delete event with their ID, and the parent would be able to delete it and then update it. The other nice thing that you'll notice is that there's no state. There is state, but there's no definitive state. You don't have to define a stateful object. It assumes that when something is updated, it will know which things it needs to update, and it will update it. This is great for the most part. It works 90% of the time. It does get annoying, say, for example, when you're emitting an event, and it doesn't realize that, hey, I need to update whenever it handles that emitted event. That can be problematic, but there's usually a way around it. But Angular sounds great. It has a few little quirks, but it sounds great. It looks great. But Angular has one big thorn. Well, I guess two, depending on how much you dislike Google. Other than Google, almost every time that Google updates Angular, the previous versions, the new version is likely not going to be compatible. You'll have to rebuild your project and change things around because they'll deprecate things. That's one of the things that is the reason that Angular is third, because it's fantastic, but we're on Angular 8 now, and every single time that a major version revision comes up, you need to change the project, and it's super annoying. And that's why if you look at the data binding, you'll notice that there's 3 or 4 different ways to data bind something, and when you're trying to find documentation, you have to define which Angular version you are, because it could change depending on which version of Angular you're using, which is super annoying. But generally, Google has really good documentation for it, so you don't have to worry about it too much. 1- and 2-way data binding is really easy, really, really fun. Code is extremely clean, and since you're using TypeScript, you'll be writing better code, writing cleaner code. It's a lot harder to sort of make a bunch of spaghetti code. So yeah, and then it's a large framework. A lot of people use it. Other than the difficulties with upgrading and maintaining, there's a lot of community support, which is great. So yeah. Let's look at Vue, our last one. Vue is sort of in the middle. It is actually the second most used, second to React. And it's a mix of the both, a mix of the two. It has the benefits and features, um, some of the benefits of both of them, which is awesome. So the first thing you'll notice is that there's significantly less files. We have a public here, which again, same exact thing as before, a bunch of metadata, and then it just tells it. It gives you the JavaScript error if you don't have JavaScript, but then it just tells you it has a div with an ID of app. This is where it tells it to inject. Same thing that we've seen from all of the other frameworks and libraries. But in here, we'll see that we have significantly less files. And this is the exact same, I believe it's, yep, same exact app as we saw before, functionally the exact same. Just wanted to show you that real quick. So yeah, all that's the same. So let's go ahead. Our main.js is where it's going to be loading up first. So this generates a new view this includes the router. You can not have a router. You can actually take the router off of Vue if you don't want it, but it is included and maintained by Vue, which is super nice. So you'll see we import the app from app.vue, we import the router from router, and we import Vue from the base library. And then in here we view it, and then we run this This is something you can ignore. This is just something for every single Vue project. But we load this app. This app in this app.vue. So we can look at the app.vue. And you'll see this app.vue has several distinct sections. So here we have a template. Right here we have a style. And then you'll have a script. This one doesn't have any scripts because it doesn't need any. But when we look at the other ones, you'll see a script. You can define the language for the style. That's really nice. We have SCSS here. I just copied and pasted it because these are global. So these are all going to be global attributes or global styles. And then we have these router links, which are telling the router where what to route to and what we are routing. And we have 2/ and 2 about. If you're not familiar, a router will basically fake like it's going to another page and will handle like if you go to /about, it doesn't actually load like a separate page. It loads the main page, but then it loads the about part of that page, and this is how it tells what needs to be loaded. So we have a router, just like the router outlet in the other one. We have a router view here. Footer and header are all the same. And then there is the router, there it is, index.js. So this has the list of routes. It's just an array. You tell it the path, the name, and the component. So path, name, component. And they do some weird stuff here where they don't actually, in this example, this is just the example one, they show you 2 different ways to include it, and this is just like a shorthand import statement where they import it inline, which is interesting. Yeah. So nothing too interesting there, you just see that they're defining the routes. So let's look at our router view defaults to /, so that's our /home, our home.view. In our home.view, you'll see we have a template, we have a script, and that's all that's in here. And it's very short, as we saw before, nothing much in here, but we have a user manager component, which is a custom component. You see we import it from here, we import it down here, and we tell it that we're going to be including these components here. We tell it we're going to be using user manager, and then we give it a name. We give this view file a name. As far as I know, it's not really used for much. You can reference it, like if you want to change things dynamically, you can reference the name if you wanted to print it out for something. But
Is it used in the router?
no, the router has separate, it uses the paths to determine which one it's going to determine the component. The name, you can like reference it, because I know sometimes like up in the the title, you can change the title to say like ACM User Manager dash home dash app, and you could use the title for that if you wanted to. Awesome. So we import this user manager. Let's look at the about.view. Very simple. This one doesn't have a script or a style. It doesn't need it. All it is base HTML. So it's just a template. And inside, we can look at our user manager. This user manager is the same exact one that we've been seeing before. And you'll notice here that we, instead of having like ngIf, we have v-if. And these are v-bindings. We have our v4 here, user in user list, as we had before. You do have to define a key. All elements have to have a key because that's a way for it to tell which ones it needs to update. And we have v-on. These are all v-bindings. Anything that starts with a v, usually v-something, is likely going to be a v-binding, which is a lot easier to keep track of because Angular has like 10 different ways to handle referencing a binding, which can be super confusing. But as you can see here, these double curly braces is the same as in Angular. It's how you access an object. And it uses JavaScript, not TypeScript. So in here, we have some data, and this data returns a function. Now, something really annoying about Vue is that you have your base sort of views, like your app.view, and then you have all of the components. And for some reason, the components are actually not for some reason. It's a pretty clear reason. This main app.view and all of the components define these differently. When you're in the app.view, you can define data as literally a JavaScript object. But inside of the components, they have to return a function. It has to have a function that returns a JavaScript object with all of the data in it. And this is just because when it is loading things, it wants to be able to call the function and grab the data that's going to be loaded on that screen. Whereas like the main app.view would have, the data is going to be there all across the app because that's sort of like the main part of the app. It is confusing and it's really annoying, especially when you're reading documentation and stuff, because sometimes they'll be referencing it differently. But that is something to keep in mind. That's pretty much the only stipulation. You have your methods here, which is another JavaScript object, which has all of the methods. Now, why wouldn't you just put the methods up here, for example? I mean, you can, but if you try to call that method, nothing will happen. If that method modifies some data in here, Vue already knows that if you're modifying the data, that it needs to update it. You don't have to tell it to modify. You don't have to tell it that you need to update it. It automatically knows. But it will not do that if it's not as part of these methods. These methods define the ones that define, whenever you define a method in here, it assumes that it needs to reload some elements, and it will check that they need to be reloaded whenever you execute something that's inside these methods. So anything that actually modifies data needs to be put inside these methods, or else it will not work. And I'm pretty sure it won't even find it for some things, which can be kind of confusing. You could define the functions up here, and then you could just define the object on delete and then the name of the function that you defined up above, if you wanted things to be more clear. But yeah. So you can see it's a lot easier. We have a style here, no style. It's scoped, which means that it's only for this file. If it wasn't scoped, then it would be just, it would combine it into this main style that's in the app.view. But we don't want to do that. We don't need to do that because we don't have anything special. So yeah, it's pretty clear. We have V models, which are ways of data binding. This is a two-way data binding. So we can grab the data that's in the search for field and we can modify the data that's in the search field. And we do that for all of these. So we have V model, V model, V model, V model. And these all bind to these data. Because they're going to be changing, they need to be inside this data so that it knows that it needs to update when things are changed. So great, and pretty much everything else here is pretty much exactly the same. Awesome. I hope that was clear. Does anybody have any questions about that? All right. Yeah. So really quickly, V bindings are easy to understand. They're easy to work with. They have the second largest community behind React, which is very nice for getting support. They don't change very often. They're in the process of moving to Vue 3. But it's not that big of a change from what I've seen. It's mostly like underlying stuff. You would have to rebuild your project if it was on Vue 2 to Vue 3. But most of the time, if you're building a project, you can assume that if you're building a project for Vue 3 today, it's not going to be, need to be completely rebuilt next year when they release a new, if they release a new version, they wouldn't do that. Whereas Angular, you'd have to worry about that constantly. Yeah, so style, template, script are all in one file. Smaller projects, it's really easy to sort of, there's not going to be as many files to manage, which is nice. Uses base.js, so you don't have to be stuck with TypeScript. It's easier to learn. As I said before, the Vue files and Vue components are defined differently, which can be kind of annoying when looking for answers whenever you're trying to figure stuff out. And it can get kind of confusing when you're trying to define your data, your props, and your methods. It's not that bad once you learn them, but whenever you're trying to define them, again, like between normal Vue files and Vue components, it can get really confusing. But it's all part of the learning process. And I think Vue, as far as being a full framework, is definitely one of the easiest to learn. So which one should you learn? Well, first, everybody should know HTML, CSS, and JS. They all use it, so you'll need to know that for all of them. React is really easy to get started with, but has significant drawbacks, as we stated before. You can't pass data back to parents, which is super annoying, no router included, and Facebook. React is created by Facebook, so do with that information as you will. Vue is slightly harder to learn than React, but includes a lot of the quality of life features that you'll see in React and Angular. But it's going to be a little bit harder to stay away from spaghetti code since everything is in one file. And you'll have to really be good about separating things, separating components, so you don't end up with bad code. And since it's not in TypeScript, you'll be more likely to write bad code. Angular is the hardest to learn. Includes a lot of new things. Everything is separated into its own file and has its own router and everything that you need to learn how it works. It's not too complicated, but it's really built from the ground up and has a lot of extra things that can be really confusing for people who just started, especially whenever it comes to like data binding, can get really confusing. But if you're looking for something that has like a high skill cap that you can continue to use for a long time and have a lot of features and not have to implement stuff yourself, Angular is really good about that. So, does anybody have any questions before I get going? I know that was a lot. It's all going to be recorded, so you can go back over it. I'm going to upload all the project files on GitHub. I'll post those in the description of the video when I upload it and on the Discord.
Do you have any preference when it comes to frameworks?
I use whichever one is just like whichever one, to be honest. Like, I originally built my website in Angular, but I'm kind of regretting it because every time I build it, it's super annoying because like it's technically out of date, but if I try to update it, then it won't work anymore. I've also rebuilt my app in Vue, and it was fine. So I have both a Vue and a Angular version of my website. I've built several projects for my work in Vue. I actually had to learn React. That's the only one that I actually had to learn because that's the one I haven't really used. It's extremely easy, but the caveats, it's super annoying to deal with. And the fact that you're relying on like external libraries and stuff instead of stuff that's built in is really annoying. And it doesn't have like a nice UI like Vue does. Vue is super nice because like you just type in Vue UI, and it actually opens like a UI that you can actually like go in and start your project. You can configure everything about the project. You can serve the project. This will run your task and give you a bunch of data about it. Tells you the module size, your dependency sizes, asset sizes, and then you can run your builds and everything. It's like really nice. You can also manage all your plugins here. So like if you wanted something for animations, actually I think Vue already has something like Vuex or something. Vuex is like a fancy state management plugin that gives you a bunch of extra features, which is nice. But yeah, it's nice. I like Vue a lot. We'll talk more about it in our next SIG WebDev meeting, especially because we're going to be starting on our project, a bigger project, and we'll need to decide on which one we want to do. So, yeah. Does anybody have any questions? I got to get going. Thank you all for coming. Make sure come to SIG WebDev for more. Thursdays at 6 p.m. on Discord and in the ACM Lounge. There's a QR code here if you're not already in the Discord, which I'm pretty sure both of you are. So yeah. This will all be recorded. I'll upload it later. Yeah. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks for hosting it.
Yeah. Of course.
Have a good day.
Yep, you too.